Good morning, everyone, and welcome to University Unitarian Church in Seattle, Washington. It's Sunday, November 29th, 2020, and my name is John Luopa. I'm the senior minister here, and I'm here with my good colleague Beth Chronister this morning, our musicians and our tech crew, and we are delighted to present and share with you this hour of worship. We are in the beginning of the holiday season now, and just to help you mark your calendars for some of our more traditional events, we will again have this year our Service of Solace on December the 9th. This is a service particularly for those folks who may be having a difficult time in the holiday season, and we encourage you or anyone you know to invite to join you in participating in that service on the 9th. On December the 20th, we will have our family holiday service here with as many of the traditional elements of that service as we can fit into 1 hour. And then, of course, on Christmas Eve, we will pre-record a service, but make it available to you through the website beginning at 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve. You can watch it then or anytime Christmas Eve or even the day after. We invite you and your friends to join us for these holiday festivities. Also a reminder that after the service each week, we have our Zoom coffee hours with separate rooms for sermon discussion, or the care team meets in one room. We're adding another one now with a book discussion or podcasts or favorite quotes with our president of the board, Rosemary Daskowitz, and of course 2 separate rooms of ministerial greeting lines where Beth and I each have a separate room to give a personal greeting and welcome to each of you. Let us begin the service this morning. We gather today as a community of faith, and we come in search of life's meaning. All of us know despair and exultation. Each of us bears a burden. All have moments of weakness and strength, and all sing songs of sorrow and love. May our worship in this hour bring us strength along our way. In the presence of the sacred, may we come to know our true selves, and finding once again a fresh impulse to do good and to love. Come, let us worship together. I invite you to join me in singing the doxology, which you will find printed on the screen, and the opening hymn immediately following. Friends, I invite you now to join me in the words that you will find printed on the screen, and know that we thank you in advance for your continued good and generous support of University Unitarian Church, its ministries, and its mission. Please join me now in saying, this church is a community of ourselves. Its energy and resources are our energy and resources. Its wealth is what we share. When we contribute to the life of this community, we affirm our lives within it.
Get on, and neither
Friends, it is my sad duty to report to us all the death last weekend of Eric Gauglitz at the age of 91. We express our sincerest condolences to his sons and their families, and we will keep you informed of any memorial acknowledgement or celebration during this pandemic time. But look for details in the gateway and on the website. We keep him in our hearts and our minds. Those of us who knew him, big, tall guy, gentle, sweet, Eric Gauglitz, may you rest in peace. This morning I would like to share with you one of my very, very favorite prayers, written by a colleague now long deceased, Max Kapp, who grew up in upstate New York as a Universalist and was very active in his local church and eventually became the president of the Universalist youth movement before the merger. He went to St. Lawrence University and its theological school for both his undergraduate and graduate training, served mostly in upstate New York, but later on at headquarters in Boston, in the Office of International Affairs. He was known as a very poetic preacher, and in his long lifetime, he gave living witness to the development of Universalism away from its Christian origins more towards a more universalistic humanitarian movement. But when I first came across this prayer, maybe 40 years ago now, it touched me deeply. So I'll read it to you, and then I'll pause, and I'll read it again. Often I have felt that I must praise my world for what my eyes and ears have seen these many years, and what my heart has loved. And often I have tried to start my lines, "Dear Earth," I say, and then I pause to look once more. Soon I am bemused and lost in wonder, so I never get beyond, "Dear Earth." Often I have felt that I must praise my world for all my eyes and ears have seen these many years, and for what my heart has loved. And often I have tried to start my line, "Dear Earth," I say, and then I pause to look once more, and soon I am bemused and far away in wonder, so I never get beyond, "Dear Earth." Amen.
I remember vividly driving through the frozen prairie to visit my grandparents each Thanksgiving. And that hour-and-a-half drive from Topeka to Abilene, it just seemed to take forever, in that way that time's passing can feel like molasses to a child. Out the car window, I would watch the broad and flat landscape of Kansas, searching for the landmarks that signaled we were getting closer to the embrace of my grandparents, Peg and Paul, and to the warm and familiar smells of the farmhouse, the place where generations of Chronisters had lived and gathered since the years following the Civil War. Several long tables would be pushed together, stretching through 2 rooms, and family and friends would decorate the house with their laughter. In contrast to Christmas, which was a holiday reserved for family members, Thanksgiving was expansive in its welcome. Friends, neighbors, and sweeties would gather round the long table to celebrate, talking for hours after the plates had been cleared and the game turned on. Now it has been decades since one of these blessed gatherings has happened, long enough for them to become mythic in my imagination. And yet I can still feel the steamy warmth of cooking in the kitchen, the taste of my grandmother's renowned gravy, and I can still revel in that sweet feeling of abundance. Now, from this memory alone, it may seem like I was spawned from a Norman Rockwell painting. But like all families, mine is more complicated than any one memory can convey. Among the sharing of food and stories were the stories not told, the ones of the lingering trauma of World War II that my grandfather carried, the stories of the loneliness my grandmother suffered having left her family and friends back east to become a farmer's wife in rural Kansas, a loneliness she tried to abate with alcohol. Or the stories of 5 kids competing for attention and resources, habits they formed in childhood and carried into adulthood, in that peculiar way that being with your family of origin can dredge up patterns that you thought were resolved. And being a family in the United States, my kin cannot be understood apart from the history of this country. There were many, many complexities never acknowledged about where we were and how we came to enjoy the abundance we did around our Thanksgiving table. My great-great-grandfather, a retired Union soldier, traveled across the United States to steward a patch of land on the prairie that would feed his descendants for more than a century. Generation after generation, harvest after harvest, they did back-breaking work in the extreme heat and humidity of the summer and the frigid winds of the winter. I come from a place of extreme weather. And this was a family history and story that I was raised to be proud of and grateful for. However, as I grew older, I began to understand more the complexity of my family system. Thank you, social work education. And I was also learning of the deep sadness and complexity of the land upon which they lived. Thank you, seminary education. The original inhabitants of the land that came to be known as Kansas were the Kansa, Osage, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, and Wichita. Families and tribes who had lived intimately connected to the land, plant and animal life for thousands of years prior to the arrival of white settlers and colonizers. And then these original tribes were joined by many others who were forced off their land in the 1820s and 30s during the Indian Removal Act, which pushed Eastern tribes off their ancestral land to make room for the insatiable hunger for land and profit by European settlers. By the 1800s, indigenous populations had already been greatly diminished by the many plagues and pandemics that had ravaged the continent following contact with Europeans centuries prior. Millions of American Indians are estimated to have died from European-born diseases. As many as 90 to 95% of the original population in the Northeast died, leaving whole villages with few or no survivors. This is the context into which the Pilgrims landed 400 years ago. The land that they imagined was waiting to receive them had actually been cleared for farming and settlement by the Wampanoag people who had lived there for thousands of years prior. The place that became known as Plymouth Rock had been the ancestral home of the Patuxet, a people who had been almost entirely wiped out by disease by the time the Pilgrims landed, save one sole survivor, an individual named Squanto, who had been enslaved, taken to Europe where he learned English, and had recently escaped to return to the place of his birth and find his people gone. Numerous plagues spread across Turtle Island, devastating the indigenous populations and laying the path for the eventual forced colonization of the whole continent by Europeans. It's jaw-dropping to read these facts in our own time of pandemic that has taken the lives of over 250,000 people and left numerous families reeling. But even living in this moment in which everything is defined by a pandemic, the devastation wrought on indigenous people by diseases feels incomprehensible. And it's important to note that this history is not unrelated to how COVID has infected American Indians at 3.5 times the rate of whites, nor the conflicts with state governments over a tribe's sovereign right to choose to close the borders of their reservations to outsiders on behalf of protecting the health of the people in the tribe. These are painful stories, but they contain a more true picture of this country and also our families. They hold important details for understanding our present. We must go beyond the myth. Kansas became a state territory in 1854, leading to more broken promises and disregarded treaties. The land that had been promised to the displaced tribes was carved up for white settlement, and a rush of European Americans came after the Civil War, a rush of them which included my ancestor. What do you do with the fullness of time in the histories of grief? What do you do with the pain that travels along our ancestral lines, transmitting trauma and unearned privileges? And in what light should we view our stories of pride and joy and gratitude in the midst of so much shadow? James Baldwin shared this perspective. American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said of it. As a daughter of the Revolution, on both sides of my family. The practice of reading history often is painful if I am engaging with my heart. It's painful, and yet I keep doing it because there can be no truth and reconciliation without truth. This process of unearthing history is all the more complicated for mixed race and interracial people and families. What do you do when the blood of the colonizers and the colonized, the enslavers and the enslaved, run through your veins and through your family tree? Is reconciliation even possible? And reconciled to exactly what, one might ask? Can we truly know one another across these lines of difference? And what do I owe, or what do I deserve, based on the lives of my ancestors, people who lived so long ago? These questions are vibrantly alive in the United States these days. There are communities and a renaissance of how history can be told from the perspective of the oppressed and not just the imagination of the oppressor. Monuments to the Confederacy are being taken down as remembrances of lynching victims, and freedom fighters are being erected. Holidays such as Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, which concoct a Eurocentric origin story to this multicultural, multiracial nation, stories that cherry-pick history, these days, these holidays are now joined by Indigenous Peoples' Day in the observance of a day of mourning, telling a more full story of this land and her many, many people. Reparations at the grassroots and policy level are being imagined to address the collective wrongs of our country's history. One thing I will say for the Trump presidency is that it has forced a reckoning with the distance between who we say we are and what we do at national, institutional, and individual levels. People and communities of conscience are grappling with this dissonance and the pain therein, how to respond. As the U.S. population tilts away from being majority white towards a more multiracial future, a revolution in how we understand ourselves is underway, and it can feel exciting. It can feel long overdue, or it can feel totally destabilizing, depending on how you look at it, maybe depending on the day. I see a couple of political tendencies in response to this revolution of story and thought. There is a conservative tendency to declare such loyalty to the idea of the United States as to deny anything that would make the U.S. seem anything less than exceptional or even divinely ordained. And there are also liberal tendencies. And I'm speaking here largely of what I have observed in white, liberal, and progressive spaces and circles reflective of my context, in which white people rush to judgment and blame, guilt and sympathy without taking actions that might create a future changed from our past. In these spaces, I see a lot of distancing from those people without the self-reflection needed, maybe the courage to find the path of personal accountability and the grace to hold ourselves and others with complexity. This, I believe, is what liberation theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, when he wrote, "Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church, church discipline, communion, without confession. I think of cheap grace oftentimes when I hear political leaders do a land acknowledgement, and yet on the original inhabitants of their land, a land upon which they are, without any actions of righting the wrongs of that history, or without any relationship to the tribes that are still here. Both the liberal and the conservative tendencies I have described here, I believe, are often driven by an unconscious avoidance of pain, of our own pain and of the pain of others. And that this is combined with an active evasion of responsibility for the legacies of our past and for the co-creation of our present. What might be an alternative approach? One that leans into pain and witnesses grief, that engages in a total relearning and leads to relationships of accountability. One of the reasons why I choose to engage anti-racism within the religious community is not because we are the most effective, the most righteous, or the most radical, but because in order for me to sustain, to take more risks, to keep returning to the call of anti-racism, I need to be held within the possibility of growth, grace, and the truth that I am more than my mistakes, recognizing that I am also bound by covenant to mend what has been broken. I need a place to weep, to confess, to strengthen the spiritual muscles of repair in this endlessly complex and changing world in which I inherited privileges I did not earn and was taught a cultural worldview born from colonization that was taught to me in history class. I want a community of people in which we grapple with our histories and our shared present, where we encourage each other to actively live out our values rather than our complicity. I long for a faith community that acts in courageous love, not cheap grace. And so, my beloved community members, what do we do about a holiday such as Thanksgiving? A holiday with traces of truth, but mostly a false memory created to instill a sense of togetherness and patriotism, denying the deep and lasting impacts of European colonization upon the native people of this land. A holiday for all its complexity that I and many others cherish, for its traditions of food, family, and gratitude. Is it possible to both love and critique a country, a community, a tradition? To sit with the complexities of history and possibly discover new ways to accept these complexities, to accept the complexities that live within a single human heart, and to find a way to act within the midst of it all. 4 years ago, I was graced by the support of this community to travel to Standing Rock in solidarity with the water protectors there, fighting the construction of an oil pipeline that threatened the river that they held as sacred, that they know as sacred, and to protect the water from which they live, drink, bathe, and irrigate their crops. What was happening at Standing Rock was a profound healing, led by the elders, women, and youth of the tribes. Indigenous people came together from all around the world to share in ceremony, to tell their individual and communal stories, to honor the earth, and to join the Oglala Lakota people in defending their sovereign rights as a tribal nation. As a white person, I was an outsider to their culture, though I was welcomed with many others at the tents which fed people abundantly at each meal. My role at Standing Rock was to humbly listen, to learn, to relearn, to offer what financial support I could, and to put my body strategically into the struggle, to carry the stories wherever I go. I remember hearing at the Sacred Fire that Standing Rock is everywhere, as we were implored to connect with the indigenous struggles for tribal sovereignty and environmental protections wherever we were. We were asked to resist erasure of Native peoples and learn the history of the land we call home, a charge I share with each of you this Thanksgiving weekend. Our church is on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people who have been here since time immemorial, and who live here still, protecting and stewarding the land and waters. The city of Seattle is named for the Duwamish chief, the Duwamish chief Sialik, who signed the 1855 Treaty of Elliott Point Bay, knowing there was no other choice for his people. Only 10 years later, in 1865, Seattle's white leadership mandated that all Native Americans be removed from the city, including the daughter of the chief. The erasure of the original inhabitants from the land of their ancestors was well underway. For decades now, the Duwamish people have been struggling for federal recognition of their tribe. Recognition that was granted after much effort, granted under the Clinton administration, and then denied under the first under Bush, and then through repeal by the Obama administration. Without this recognition, they are barred from accessing their rights signed into that 1855 treaty, and they cannot benefit from potential economic empowerment through the gaming industry. So much is owed to this tribe whose land, forcibly bought for a paltry sum, has been built into one of the most expensive cities in the country. Despite disappointments in gaining federal recognition, the tribe continues to organize for their rights, and I've invited people who live or work in Seattle to join in repairing some of what our federal and local governments have wrought. Real Rent Duwamish is an organization created and run by the Duwamish tribe. This fund collects monthly rent from individuals and organizations, recognizing that the Duwamish tribe was never justly compensated for their lands. All of the funds collected through rent go directly to Duwamish tribal services to support the revival of Duwamish culture and the vitality of the Duwamish tribe. And just 2 weeks ago, Real Rent Duwamish reached over 10,000 renters. I became a real renter in the years since returning from Standing Rock, and I know a number of UUC families also pay rent each month to the tribe. I pay $18.55 each month in memory of that year that the treaty was signed. And on this November morning, the Social Justice Steering Committee and I ask you to consider joining, not only as a real renter, but also in seeking ways to join their community in solidarity as they work to restore the Duwamish watershed and in their ongoing fight against erasure. There are painful and shameful stories in our history. But faith tells us that this is not all that we or anyone are. For there are also healing stories. Stories of transformation and of awakening, stories in which pain is acknowledged, brought to the light so that healing might occur. How do you love a country as complicated as ours? You pour your generous heart into a greater healing that is beyond any one of us and yet includes all of us. I close with these words from Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Would you please join me now in singing hymn number 128, For All That Is Our Life. I close once more with the words from the poet Joy Harjo, who is the first American Indian named U.S. Poet Laureate, who was just named to a rare third term in that role and is a member of the Muskogee Creek tribe. This is an excerpt from her poem, Remember. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth, we are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember.